The most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is notice someone invisible. I did not understand that truth the morning my life changed. At 28 years old, I was used to being overlooked. I worked 6 days a week at a small cafe tucked between a dry cleaner and a bookstore on the north side of Chicago. Most customers never remembered my name. They remembered their coffee order. They remembered the free Wi-Fi. They remembered whether it was raining outside. But me? I was just another waitress carrying trays and forcing tired smiles through 12-hour shifts. That Tuesday started like every other. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Soft music played through ceiling speakers. Rain tapped gently against the front windows. I was balancing 2 plates and a large coffee when the cafe door opened. The room changed instantly. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Even before I looked up, I felt it. That strange shift that happens when someone important enters a room. Then I saw him. Tall. Impeccably dressed. Dark tailored suit. Calm expression. The kind of man who looked completely comfortable in any environment because he controlled every environment he entered. Alexander Moretti. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Billionaire investor. Business owner. Philanthropist. Depending on who was telling the story, something far more powerful than that. I had seen his face in newspapers and on television. Yet seeing him in person felt different. More intimidating. More real. His presence seemed to absorb all the attention around him. Several people immediately reached for their phones. Others whispered. Alexander ignored them all. He simply walked toward a corner table near the window and sat down alone. For the next 20 minutes, I tried not to look at him. I focused on customers. Refilled coffee cups. Wiped tables. Took orders. But every time I glanced across the room, I noticed the same thing. He was not working. He was not speaking. He was simply staring through the rain-covered glass at the city beyond. There was something unexpectedly lonely about it. Then everything happened at once. A young woman carrying a laptop rushed toward the exit. Someone accidentally bumped her shoulder. Her coffee spilled directly across the floor. The woman slipped. The laptop flew from her hands. Before anyone could react, I dropped my tray and caught her arm. The laptop hit my shoulder instead of the ground. Pain shot through my arm, but the woman stayed upright. The cafe fell silent. Are you okay? I asked. The woman nodded rapidly. Embarrassed. Relieved. A few customers clapped softly. I laughed awkwardly and bent down to clean the mess. When I stood up again, Alexander Moretti was watching me. Not casually. Not politely. Watching me with complete focus. The room seemed strangely quiet despite all the noise around us. For a moment, neither of us looked away. Then something happened that nobody expected. The Millionaire Mafia boss stood up, walked across the cafe, and stopped directly in front of me. My heart immediately began racing. His expression remained unreadable. Calm. Controlled. Intentional. Then he smiled slightly and said 6 words that would change everything. I think I have been looking for you. The moment he smiled at me, something inside shifted, and I felt an unfamiliar pull toward a life I had never imagined. Alexander Moretti did not waste words. He simply gestured to the empty chair across from him, and I walked over, every step echoing in the quiet cafe, as if the world had shrunk to just the 2 of us. Sitting down, I noticed the way his eyes never wavered from mine, steady and assessing, yet with a subtle warmth that made my chest tighten. You are not like anyone I have met, he said softly, and I found myself nodding, unsure why these words struck so deeply. We spoke about trivial things first, the weather, the cafe, Chicago's rainy streets, but each sentence carried a weight, a hint that our lives were about to intertwine in ways beyond ordinary understanding. As he listened, he laughed lightly at my awkward attempts to describe my work schedule, and I noticed how effortless his charm was, drawing me in without even trying. Outside, the rain continued, tapping against the glass like a gentle drum, mirroring the rapid pace of my heartbeat. For a moment, I forgot the world beyond this room, the problems, the bills, the never-ending cycle of serving coffee and pastries. Alexander leaned forward, hands resting calmly on the table, and asked questions about my past, my ambitions, the small joys and struggles of a life lived quietly. I spoke hesitantly at first, then with more honesty, drawn by an instinctive trust one did not understand. He nodded, listening intently, his expression unreadable, yet somehow reassuring. The cafe staff moved around us, The hum of conversation a distant murmur, as if we existed in our own bubble of reality. Then, without warning, he smiled, a faint, knowing smile, and said, "I believe we could change everything." The words sent a shiver through me, a mixture of excitement and fear, as I realized that this encounter was not random, that my ordinary world was about to collide with his extraordinary life. The rain outside seemed to intensify, streaking the windows, creating reflections of light that danced across the floor, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the shift that had begun. I looked at Alexander and felt a rare clarity, a sense that, despite all my previous solitude, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Each passing moment heightened the tension, the unspoken understanding that our lives would be intertwined in ways I could not yet foresee, and yet, somehow, it felt inevitable. He was the billionaire mafia boss, untouchable in his power and status, and I was the ordinary waitress. Yet there was a connection, an unspoken promise of change, of discovery, of a story unfolding that neither of us could resist being part of. The café, the rain, the quiet murmurs of the customers faded away, leaving only the magnetic presence of Alexander and the undeniable sense that my life had taken a turn I would never forget. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight and lingering rain clouds, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. I stood outside the cafe 20 minutes before my shift started, staring at my reflection in the glass door and wondering if the previous afternoon had actually happened. The billionaire who seemed to own half the city had sat across from me, listened to my story, and looked at me as if I mattered. The idea felt ridiculous. People like Alexander Moretti lived in a different universe. People like me watched that universe from a distance. Yet as I pushed open the door and stepped inside, I found myself searching for him without meaning to. The familiar scent of coffee beans and baked pastries filled the air. Customers arrived in waves. Orders stacked up. Cups clattered. The rhythm of work should have distracted me. Instead, every passing hour seemed to sharpen my curiosity. Around noon, my manager approached carrying a sealed envelope. "This was delivered for you," she said. My stomach tightened immediately. Nobody delivered letters to me. Not anymore. I wiped my hands on my apron and carefully opened it. Inside was a simple card with elegant handwriting. No logo. No dramatic message. Just one sentence. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Beneath the sentence was a name. Alexander. I read it twice. Then a third time. Something about the message felt different from what I expected. There was no arrogance. No attempt to impress me. Just sincerity. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Customers came and went. Outside, the clouds slowly cleared. Sunlight reflected against wet pavement, turning ordinary streets into rivers of gold. By the time my shift ended, I felt exhausted. Yet when I stepped outside, a black luxury car was waiting across the street. My pulse instantly quickened. The rear door opened. A well-dressed driver stepped out. "Miss Carter," he asked politely. I nodded cautiously. "Mr. Moretti would like to invite you to dinner this evening. There is no pressure. If you decline, I will simply wish you a pleasant evening." I almost laughed from disbelief. This kind of thing happened in movies. Not in real life. Certainly not in my life. Every logical part of my brain told me to walk away. Yet another part remembered the honesty in Alexander's eyes. The loneliness I had seen behind all that confidence. "Just dinner?" I asked. The driver smiled slightly. "Just dinner." 2 hours later, I stood in front of my apartment mirror trying to decide whether I had completely lost my mind. My nicest dress was simple compared to the world Alexander belonged to, but it was clean, elegant, and the best I had. As the city lights began appearing outside my window, I took a deep breath and stepped into the waiting car. Chicago glowed beneath the evening sky as we traveled downtown. The farther we drove, the more unreal everything felt. Eventually, the car stopped in front of a quiet rooftop restaurant overlooking the skyline. Wind moved gently across the terrace. Candlelight flickered against polished glass walls. And standing near the railing, hands in his pockets as he watched the sunset, was Alexander Moretti. The moment he turned and saw me, his expression softened into a genuine smile. For reasons I could not explain, my nervousness disappeared. It felt less like meeting the most powerful man in the city and more like returning to a conversation that had somehow begun long before either of us realized it. The evening air was crisp as I followed Alexander through the softly lit streets, each step echoing against the cobblestones beneath our feet. The city seemed to transform around us, lights reflecting in puddles left by an earlier drizzle, giving the illusion that we were walking through a place both familiar and entirely new. He spoke little, his presence commanding yet oddly comforting, and I found myself studying him in a way I never had before. How his tailored suit hinted at elegance without ostentation, how the subtle tilt of his head suggested attentiveness even in silence. We arrived at a small, private rooftop terrace that overlooked the sprawling skyline, the wind teasing strands of my hair as we stepped out. Alexander gestured to a corner table where soft candlelight flickered against polished silverware, casting gentle shadows across the tablecloth. The moment felt surreal. The bustling sounds of the city faded, leaving a quiet cocoon around us. He offered me a seat, and I obliged, my hands brushing against the fine fabric of the chair, aware of the weight of the evening. Conversation began slowly, tentative at first, as if both of us were navigating a delicate balance between curiosity and caution. He asked about my life, my work, and my dreams, listening with an intensity that made each word I spoke feel significant. In turn, I learned about the commitments and responsibilities that shaped his world, the quiet moments behind the public persona of a millionaire, and the subtle sacrifices that power demanded. The sky deepened into shades of indigo and violet, stars emerging one by one, punctuating the night with silver pinpricks. As dessert arrived, a shared plate of rich chocolate and fresh berries, we laughed over small stories from our pasts, a gentle warmth settling over the space between us. For a moment, the gap between two vastly different lives seemed to narrow, and the thought that we might connect beyond the surface was both thrilling and terrifying. He reached across the table, lightly brushing his hand against mine, a gesture so simple yet weighted with unspoken meaning. The city below continued to hum with life, but up here, above the lights and sounds, the evening stretched into something timeless, a memory in the making. Our conversation continued, weaving between light-hearted anecdotes and more serious reflections, each exchange building a quiet intimacy that neither of us rushed nor forced. By the time the first hint of morning began to touch the horizon, I realized that the night had shifted something within me, a subtle acknowledgement that meeting Alexander was more than coincidence. It was the start of a story neither of us could have anticipated, yet one that already felt inevitable and undeniably real. The morning sunlight felt different when I opened my eyes. For the first time in years, I woke up smiling before I even remembered why. Then I saw the business card resting on my nightstand, and everything came rushing back. The rooftop dinner, the conversation that lasted for hours, the way Alexander listened as if every word mattered, the look in his eyes when he spoke about dreams instead of money. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone like him had somehow stepped into my ordinary life. Outside my apartment window, Chicago was already awake. Cars moved through the streets below. People hurried toward offices. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet somehow, everything felt different. At the cafe, my coworkers noticed the change immediately. They asked why I seemed happier, why I kept smiling when nobody was talking to me. I blamed the weather. Nobody believed me. The lunch rush arrived and carried me through the afternoon. Orders piled up. Customers filled every table. The familiar chaos usually consumed all my attention. Not today. Every time the front door opened, a small part of me looked up. Around 3 o'clock, a delivery arrived. A large arrangement of white roses sat inside an elegant box. My manager called my name from across the room. Every customer nearby immediately turned to look. Heat rushed to my face as I walked over. Attached to the flowers was a simple handwritten note. I hope today gives you as many reasons to smile as you gave me yesterday. Alexander. My hands trembled slightly as I folded the note. Nobody had ever sent me flowers before. Not like this. Not without expecting something in return. Throughout the rest of my shift, I caught myself glancing at the roses every few minutes. They sat near the register, filling the cafe with a soft fragrance that somehow made the entire room feel brighter. That evening, after work, I walked home carrying the flowers carefully through the city streets. The sky glowed orange and gold as the sun disappeared behind distant buildings. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Then my phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. For a moment I hesitated. Then I answered. Hello. A familiar voice responded immediately. Calm, deep, warm. I was hoping you would answer. A smile appeared before I could stop it. I was hoping it was you. Silence followed for a second. Not awkward silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that feels natural. Alexander laughed softly. I spent most of today thinking about our conversation. My heart skipped. I slowed my pace as I continued walking beneath rows of glowing streetlights. We talked for nearly an hour. About nothing important and everything important at the same time. Books, family, childhood memories, favorite places in Chicago, dreams neither of us had shared with many people. The city moved around me while his voice filled the space between. One heartbeat and the next. When we finally ended the call, I stood outside my apartment building looking up at the night sky. A message appeared on my phone seconds later. I opened it immediately. There was only one sentence. Dinner tomorrow? I looked at the screen and laughed quietly to myself. Somewhere in this enormous city, one of the most powerful men in America was waiting for my answer. And for the first time, I was not afraid of what came next. I was excited. The next evening arrived far more slowly than it should have. Every glance at the clock felt like an hour. Every customer at the cafe seemed determined to stay longer than usual. By the time my shift finally ended, I was convinced the universe was testing my patience. Yet the moment I stepped outside and saw the familiar black car waiting near the curb, every trace of frustration disappeared. The driver greeted me warmly and opened the door. As the city lights drifted past the window during the drive downtown, I found myself smiling without any reason at all. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to something instead of simply getting through another day. Tonight felt different. Not because of the restaurant or the luxury surrounding Alexander's world. It felt different because I wanted to see him. The car eventually stopped in front of a historic building overlooking the Chicago River. Soft lights glowed behind enormous windows. The entire place looked elegant without feeling intimidating. When I entered, Alexander was already waiting. The moment he stood and smiled, the nervousness I had carried all day disappeared. Somehow, being around him felt surprisingly easy. We spent the first hour talking about ordinary things. My coworkers, his favorite childhood memories, the worst jobs either of us had ever worked. At one point I laughed so hard that several people at nearby tables looked over. Alexander seemed pleased by that. As the evening continued, however, the conversation slowly became more personal, more honest. He told me about growing up surrounded by expectations, about how people often saw his success before they saw him, about the loneliness that came from never knowing who genuinely cared and who simply wanted access to his world. His voice remained calm, but I could hear something deeper beneath the words. Years of responsibility, years of isolation, years of carrying burdens alone. For a moment, the powerful businessman disappeared. In his place sat a man who simply wanted someone to understand him. I surprised myself by sharing things I rarely discussed with anyone. The financial struggles, the disappointments, the relationships that had failed because people underestimated my ambitions or dismissed my dreams. Alexander listened the same way he always did. Completely focused, completely present. No interruptions, no distractions, just attention. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt incredibly rare. Later, we stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the river. The city sparkled around us. Boats moved slowly across dark water. Reflections danced beneath the bridges. A cool breeze carried the sounds of distant traffic and laughter. We stood beside the railing, neither speaking for a while. The silence felt comfortable, natural. Eventually Alexander turned toward me. The lights of the city reflected in his eyes. You know what surprised me most? He asked quietly. I shook my head. You never once treated me differently after learning who I was. I smiled. Maybe because I was more interested in who you are. Something changed in his expression then. A softness I had never seen before. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. The city seemed to disappear. The noise faded. Time slowed. And standing beneath the lights of Chicago, I realized this was no longer curiosity. No longer fascination. Something far more important had quietly begun growing between us, and neither of us wanted to pretend otherwise. The days that followed seemed to move with a rhythm all their own. Every morning began with a message. Every evening ended with a conversation. Somewhere between those moments, without either of us planning it, Alexander became part of my daily life. I would catch myself smiling at my phone during lunch breaks. He would somehow remember small details I had mentioned only once. My favorite author. The name of my first dog. The dream I had buried years ago of opening a bookstore cafe of my own. Nobody had ever listened that carefully before. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander invited me to join him at a charity event sponsored by one of his foundations. The invitation immediately made me nervous. His world and mine still felt impossibly different. Yet when I arrived, he greeted me with the same genuine smile I had come to recognize. There were no reporters surrounding him, no dramatic displays of wealth. Instead, I watched him spend hours talking with families, volunteers, teachers, and children. He knew names. He remembered stories. He listened. The experience challenged everything I thought I knew about powerful people. Later that evening, as the event ended and guests slowly departed, we found ourselves walking through a quiet riverside park. The sun had already disappeared, leaving behind a sky painted with deep shades of blue and silver. Lights reflected across the water. The city hummed softly in the distance. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Then Alexander stopped walking. I turned toward him. His expression carried a seriousness I had not seen before. "There is something you should know," he said quietly. My heart immediately tightened. The warmth of the evening suddenly felt fragile. "What is it?" I asked. He looked out across the river before answering. "My life is not always simple. There are responsibilities that come with it. Expectations. Pressures. Some people see my success and assume it solves everything. It does not." I listened carefully. He was not asking for sympathy. He was offering honesty. There was a difference. "I know there are parts of your world I do not understand," I said softly. "But I am not interested in your money or your reputation." He looked back at me then. The city lights reflected in his eyes. "That is exactly why you matter." The words settled between us. Simple, direct, completely sincere. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cool breeze drifted through the trees above us. Somewhere nearby, laughter echoed from a restaurant patio. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet everything felt significant. Alexander took a slow breath. "Before you came along, I spent years surrounded by people. Yet somehow I was alone most of the time." His voice was calm, but the vulnerability beneath it was unmistakable. I stepped closer, not because I had planned to, but because it felt natural. "You are not alone anymore," I said. The faint smile that followed was unlike any I had seen from him before. It was not the smile of a billionaire, not the smile of a powerful man. It was the smile of someone finally beginning to believe that happiness might actually be possible. And standing beside the river beneath the lights of Chicago, I realized I was beginning to believe it too. The next morning arrived with a soft gray light filtering through the blinds, and the apartment felt quieter than usual, almost suspended in time. Yet the hum of the city reminded me that life outside continued with its relentless pace. I moved through the routine of making breakfast, the aroma of coffee filling the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, knowing that Alexander would be coming over later, his presence a comforting certainty in an otherwise unpredictable world. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart skipped in recognition, and as I opened the door, he was standing there with that familiar calm and gentle smile, dressed casually yet impeccably, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he insisted I accept, not for any formal reason, but simply to bring a moment of happiness. And I could not help but feel a warmth spreading through me, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. We sat together at the kitchen table, talking about trivial things at first, the kind of mundane details that somehow felt extraordinary in this shared space. From the books we were reading to the way the morning sun fell across the city skyline visible through the window. And as the conversation drifted, I realized how easily we could laugh together, the ease of it unlike anything I had experienced before, a rare connection that seemed to dissolve any remaining distance between our worlds. Later, we decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, the streets still damp from a morning drizzle, reflections of street lights shimmering on the wet pavement. And as we walked side by side, our hands occasionally brushing, there was a quiet understanding passing between us, a mutual recognition that the moments we shared were building something meaningful, fragile yet potent. And I found myself observing him closely, noticing the subtle expressions that revealed both his strength and vulnerability. The way his eyes held a depth that hinted at stories untold, a mixture of resilience and gentleness that drew me in irresistibly. We paused at a small park, the bench by the fountain offering a perfect vantage point over the pond where ducks glided gracefully. And Alexander turned to me with a seriousness that made me sit up a little straighter, his voice soft but deliberate as he said, "I want you to know that no matter what the future holds, I choose you, not because of circumstance or convenience, but because you are genuinely a part of my life in ways I never anticipated." And in that moment, the words hung in the cool air, carrying weight and sincerity that resonated deeply within me, the city noises fading to a distant murmur, leaving only the truth of our connection. As we sat there together, side by side, the water reflecting the dim light of the cloudy sky, I felt a sense of peace, a rare clarity that even amidst uncertainties, this moment was ours, and the fragile beauty of it was not lost on either of us. The kind of quiet affirmation that often precedes profound change, yet for now, all that mattered was the shared presence, the laughter and words exchanged, and the simple, undeniable fact that our paths had converged in a way that made the ordinary feel miraculous, a beginning that promised depth, trust, and the slow unfolding of something extraordinary. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in a beautiful blur, each day adding another layer to the connection that neither of us had expected to find. What began as a chance encounter inside a small neighborhood café had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. I no longer measured my days by work schedules or unpaid bills. Instead, I found myself looking forward to conversations, shared experiences, and the simple comfort of knowing that someone genuinely cared whether I smiled that morning or slept well the night before. One evening, Alexander invited me to a private gathering at one of his properties overlooking Lake Michigan. The drive there felt peaceful. The city lights faded behind us as the shoreline stretched across the horizon. When we arrived, I expected something extravagant. Instead, I found warmth. Soft lights illuminated the terrace. Music played quietly in the background. A small group of close friends and family members filled the space with laughter and easy conversation. There were no cameras, no reporters, no displays of status, just people who genuinely mattered to him. Throughout the evening, I watched Alexander interact with everyone around him. The powerful businessman the world admired seemed to disappear. In his place stood a man who cared deeply about the people in his life. A man who remembered birthdays, checked on elderly relatives, and listened more than he spoke. Each new discovery made me admire him even more. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, we walked toward a wooden pier extending over the water. The lake reflected thousands of stars. Gentle waves moved beneath us. Cool air carried the scent of the shoreline. We stopped near the end of the pier and stood quietly beside each other. Neither of us seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, Alexander spoke. "Before I met you, success always felt incomplete." His voice was calm, but the sincerity behind it was unmistakable. I looked at him carefully. "Why?" He smiled softly. "Because I spent years building a life that looked impressive from the outside, while feeling empty on the inside." The honesty in his words touched me more than any grand gesture ever could. For a moment, we simply stood there, listening to the water. Then he turned toward me completely. The reflection of moonlight danced across his face. "You changed that." My heart immediately tightened. Not from fear, from gratitude. From the realization that this extraordinary man was sharing the most vulnerable parts of himself without hesitation. I reached for his hand. "You changed my life too." The smile that followed was filled with relief, warmth, and hope. In that moment, the differences between our worlds no longer seemed important. Wealth, status, reputation, none of it mattered. What mattered was trust, respect, understanding. What mattered was the feeling of being truly seen. As we stood together beneath the stars, watching the lights of distant boats move across the lake, I realized that the greatest gift Alexander had ever given me was not luxury or opportunity. It was certainty. The certainty that I was valued exactly as I was. And for the first time in both of our lives, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like something to build together.